Well, welcome to our monthly webinar for United for Homes endorsers, and we're happy that you all could join us this afternoon. As you know, the United for Homes campaign proposes two modest reforms to the mortgage interest deduction and invest those savings in affordable housing for the lowest income households who have the greatest housing needs. The two modest reforms are to lower the amount of money that's eligible for a tax benefit from $1 million to $500,000 in a mortgage. And the second modest reform is to convert the deduction to a tax credit. And so today's topic is going to be deductions, credits, and homeownership. And we're going to talk about the impact of those modest reforms to the MID. So what we're going to do is first, Renee Willis will give a field update about what's been happening in the field. I'll then start our presentation on today's topic, and I'll talk a little bit about the difference between deductions and tax credits. And then Eric Toder, who's co-director of the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center, is going to talk about the impact of those reforms to the MID on taxes. And Eric, the Tax Policy Center has, for a number of years, done these estimates for us and what the impact of our proposal would be. And then we will open it up for questions. Just a little reminder, which I mentioned, that the United for Homes campaign is a national campaign to rebalance federal housing policy and to make changes to the mortgage interest deduction to provide tax relief to more low and moderate income homeowners, and also to invest significant savings of those reforms into programs to ensure that the lowest income people in the United States have decent and affordable homes. And then with that, I'm going to turn it over for a few minutes to Renee Willis, our Vice President of Communications and Field, to give us a policy update.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. Just wanted to share with you some exciting things that have happened since our last webinar. First, on the Common Sense Housing Investment Act, as you may remember, this past February, Representative Allison reintroduced the act. And the act, or the bill, calls for modest reforms to the mortgage interest deduction and reinvesting the savings into providing affordable housing for people with the greatest needs. So since our last call, we have now, or at least the bill has two new co-sponsors, Representative Lee from California and also Representative Dwight Evans from Pennsylvania. Also, just last week we had our annual lobby day, and almost just about 130 advocates came to D.C. and met with over 125 congressional offices to talk about H.R. 948, which is the Common Sense Housing Investment Act, and other priorities. So we were really excited to see those advocates in D.C. and taking the opportunity to speak with their members of Congress. Also, since our last webinar, we had, or at least the U.S. News and World Report, published a joint op-ed with Michael Stegman and Dennis Shea, which really just makes the case for the United for Homes campaign and for the tax reform proposals. This is significant because Mr. Stegman served as an advisor to President Obama, and Mr. Shea worked with the George Bush administration and worked with HUD. The op-ed can be found. We provided a link in this PowerPoint presentation, and it can be found by following that link. But also, too, it's important because it really just makes the case for the United for Homes campaign, and it speaks to this being really a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make critical adjustments to federal housing policy. So take a read. It's a great op-ed. And then the last bit of information, the endorser list, we are now up to 2,344 endorsers for the campaign. So thank you very much for your advocacy in the field and your continued support. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, who will get into the weeds of credits and deductions.
Well, I'm not going to get as much into the weeds as Eric will probably get into the weeds. But to start today's topic, just to give a little bit overview on deductions and tax credits. We're often asked how the United for Homes proposal would help lower and moderate income homeowners, and why a tax credit might serve more homeowners than an itemized deduction does, which is currently what the mortgage interest deduction is. And so before Eric discusses the impact of our reforms, or our proposed reforms, I just wanted to take a few minutes to explain the difference between a deduction and a tax credit. And on the next slide here, I have a couple of definitions that come in handy as we talk about this topic. The first one is a standard deduction. A standard deduction is a set dollar amount that reduces your taxable income. And so when you fill out your tax return, you may choose to take a standard deduction from your income that you pay taxes on. And so, for example, if you're a married couple, if you're not over 65, and if neither of you are blind, the standard deduction that you can take, you can deduct from your income that you don't pay taxes on, is $12,600 last year. An itemized deduction is also something that reduces your taxable income. And common deductions that people take or the largest ones are charitable contributions, state and local income taxes can be a deduction, real estate taxes, and the one we're going to talk about today, the mortgage interest deduction. But to take advantage of itemized deductions, you have to give up your standard deduction. So you choose one or the other. When you file your taxes, you reduce your income by either your itemized deductions or your standard deduction. And that matters, which we'll discover later on. The other thing I wanted to define is what is a tax credit. And a tax credit works differently than a deduction. A tax credit doesn't lower your taxable income, but it reduces or lowers your tax liability. And so, for example, if you owe taxes of $1,000 and you have a tax credit from something that's $600, the tax liability left is $400, $1,000 minus $600. And you don't need to itemize your deductions to receive a tax credit. It's just there if you qualify for a particular tax credit. And the other thing I want to point out, because it's part of our proposal, is what we propose is converting the mortgage interest deduction to a non-refundable tax credit, which basically just means that if your credit is greater than your tax liability, you can't result in a negative liability. And so if you owe taxes of $1,000 and your tax credit is $1,100, you don't get the $100, the negative $100 that you owe. You don't get that back. You don't get it refunded to you. And so that's what we mean by these things. And so the question becomes, why would we want to convert the mortgage interest deduction to a tax credit? And the reality is that the mortgage interest deduction benefits only a small portion of taxpayers, and it doesn't even benefit all mortgage holders. And so keeping in mind the mortgage interest deduction is an itemized deduction, so you have to itemize your deductions, not take the standard deduction in order to benefit from it. And only about 30% of all tax returns include itemized deductions. And then if we look more deeply into just what tax returns include the MID, only about 22% of all tax returns include the MID. And so it's only taken by a little more than 1 out of 5 taxpayers or tax returns. Of course, we're interested in the mortgage holders because they're the ones who can take it. But even if we look only at mortgage holders, about 59% of mortgage holders or tax returns of mortgage holders benefit from the MID. So there's a large number of people, homeowners, who don't benefit from the mortgage interest deduction. The other thing I just want to point out is itemized deductions are much more likely among higher income taxpayers. And so this is data from the IRS statement of income. And as we can see, if your income is between $25,000 and $50,000 a year, only about 20% take or itemize their deductions, versus 93% of tax returns with income over $200,000 itemize their deductions. So higher income households are more likely to itemize their deductions, as well as benefit from the mortgage interest deduction. And here is just looking specifically at the mortgage interest deduction, much more likely to be taken among higher income taxpayers. This is also data from the IRS statement of income data. And if you just look at a couple of bars here, you'll see that slightly more than 12% of tax returns between $25,000 and $50,000 a year claim the MID. versus about 70% of tax returns for $100,000 or more. And then the other thing I would like to point out is that higher income taxpayers also receive the greatest benefit. So not only are they more likely to take it, they receive a greater benefit from it. And there's a couple of reasons for that. And you'll see, for example, if you look at this graph, you'll see that the income increases, so does the average benefit to the tax return. The reason for that is, like, as if you're higher income, you're likely going to have a larger mortgage, as well as you're in a higher marginal tax rate. And so the deduction is because of that higher tax rate, you get more of a benefit from it. So once again, why do we want to convert the mortgage interest deduction to a tax credit? It's mainly because taxpayers don't take items, because their standard deduction is a better deal for them. It's better for them to take the standard deduction than the itemized deduction. And so if you're a married couple, and your itemized deductions don't come to $12,600, you take the $12,600. If you have a mortgage and pay interest, it doesn't affect your taxes. And a tax credit would expand the tax benefit of a mortgage to more homeowners, because the tax credit could be taken by anyone with mortgage interest, regardless of the deduction, regardless of whether they standardize their deductions or itemize their deductions. And more low and moderate income homeowners would benefit from their mortgage interest. They get tax benefit from their mortgage that they currently don't do now, because they're not itemizing their deductions, allowing their interest to do so. And that's sort of the general overview of why we propose converting it to a tax credit. At the same time, it saves money, $240 billion over 10 years that could then be reinvested in affordable housing. Eric is here today. We're thankful that he's here today to talk more specifically about the specific impacts of this proposal. And I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And I'm just going to briefly summarize the results of an analysis we did for the coalition of these proposals last year. And the numbers would be changed a little bit if we did it this year, because we have a new CBO baseline, but this is very close to what they would be. So it's pretty up to date. Let me first start by summarizing the proposals. Andrew said 1 million. It says 1.1 million. That's because there is a 1 million cap on original mortgage interest debt that is eligible for the deduction, but you can also take an additional $100,000 of home equity loans. And the IRS now allows you to combine the two. It became too complicated to decide which is which. So effectively, the limit is 1.1. The way we scored the proposal was if it reduced the sum of the two to 500,000. So this chart really shows the different treatment today. Itemizers can deduct interest on up to 1.1 million of debt. Non-itemizers cannot deduct their mortgage interest. The first option would equalize the treatment of itemizers and non-itemizers. They would get a 15% credit instead of a deduction on up to 1.1 million of debt. Option 2 just simply reduces the mortgage interest limit to 500,000 the debt. You can deduct interest only in your first $500,000 of debt, and that would continue the distinction between itemizers and non-itemizers. And option 3 is simply just a combination of both 1 and 2 taken together. So I'll talk mostly about option 3, but a little bit about the other two. So this is the revenue table over the next 10 years. These lines rise pretty sharply the first 5 years because the proposals are phased in at a rate of 20% per year. So the 15% credit is 3% the first year, 6% the second year, and so on, reaches 15% after 5 years. So the deduction goes away also at 20% per year, so you get to deduct 80% of your interest the first year, 60% the second year, and then 0 after 5 years. And the limit also falls by 100,000 a year. So that's why we have the phase-in. So you could see that option 1, you can't see in this number, by the end of the 10-year period, option 1 is raising a little over $30 billion, option 2 is raising a bit under 20, and option 3 is raising somewhat over 40. Option 1 plus option 2 don't add up to option 3 because there are some interactions between the two. So the sum is less than, the total amount is less than each one taken separately. So if we go, the numbers over 10 years not shown on this are, as Andrew said, $240 billion for the total proposal, $190 billion for option 1, and $87 billion for option 2. Okay, this really will repeat what Andrew said. We're just looking now at options 1 and 3, which is the credit, and current law on option 2, which is the deduction. The change in the cap doesn't affect the number of people who benefit from the deduction. It just reduces the benefit that some people receive. So if you look at for all the options, the people who receive the credit, there are more of them who benefit from the credit than who benefit from the deduction. And that, as Andrew said, is because the credit is available for people who don't itemize on their tax returns. For the people with less than $50,000, very few benefit from very small percentage benefit from either. That's because the credit is not refundable. It can't be used by people with no income. And of course, a smaller percentage of households are homeowners in low-income groups. And many of those who are homeowners in the lowest income groups are senior citizens who have paid off their mortgages, so they're not taking any interest deductions. So when you get to the 50 to 125,000, I've kind of aggregated these groups. Then you get the biggest jump. It's from 25% who can use it to 44%, and then at the very top, almost everybody who has mortgage interest is an itemizer, in the over $1 million. So the number of people who can use the deduction doesn't change very much. On to the next one. So this is basically showing the changes in average federal tax rates. The numbers are small, so I carry them to 2 decimal places, but this is basically your tax divided by your income. So it's an indication of how progressive the change is. In the bottom group, people making less than $75,000, there's a tax cut for option 1 and option 3. Option 2 basically has no effect on them. Very few people in that income group have mortgages that are big enough to matter. For the higher income people, though, on average, taxes are increasing because they're losing more from the deduction than they're gaining from the increased credit. So even though more people are getting the credit, if you're in the higher tax bracket, a deduction, which might save you 28 cents or 36 cents or 39.6 cents on the dollar, is worth more to you than a 15% credit. So that's the reason, as you get higher up the scale, you get relatively more people benefiting. In the case of the very highest people, which is over $1 million, there are not that many people who are benefiting, basically because they're certainly option 3. Some of them are capped, and also I mean not many people. I'm sorry, saying the wrong way. It's not the number of people. It's the tax increase. There's not that big a tax increase as a percentage of income because basically your housing expenditures don't rise in proportion to your income when you're above a certain level. So while you're getting a bigger absolute benefit as a share of your income, it's smaller. So this is a proposal which benefits mostly the upper middle income people, the mortgage deduction, and they're the ones who then pay the biggest tax increase from losing the deduction. The credit partially compensates them, but not fully. So the other thing we did, they asked us to do was look at the difference across states, and under option 3, which is a full proposal, taxpayers in all states would pay more federal tax than under current law, with 4 exceptions: Wyoming, West Virginia, South Dakota, and North Dakota. Basically, people in small rural states are not paying that much more because many in those states, not that many people are taking the mortgage interest deduction in the first place. So there are not as many people using the deduction. The states that are hit hardest are the states with the biggest housing expenditures, which is the number of people who take the deduction, and that's the District of Columbia has the highest average tax increase, and then Maryland and Virginia close behind. California is second, and New Jersey is fifth, and all of those are significantly above the average tax rate for the country as a whole. If you look at the full report, which is on our website, you can find out how your state is affected. The next figure is just a picture which shows the ones that decrease, the ones that barely increase, the ones that increase moderately, and the ones that increase the most. And again, you could see that the ones that increase moderately or the most are pretty much concentrated in the northeastern section of the country, some of them in the south like Georgia and Florida, and then also in the far west, California being one of the heaviest hit states. States in the south, states in the middle, the mountain states are least affected. Next slide is the percentage of units with a tax cut. Overall, in the U.S., about 31% get a tax cut, and those again are the percentage with the tax cuts. We've looked at this for selected states. 8 selected states in the report. I just showed 4 of them in the chart here, which are different. You can see that fewer people benefit in California and New York because there are more people taking the mortgage interest deduction, so fewer people get a tax cut, and on average, but the people who get the most tax cuts are the people in the 75 to 200, where most of the people are affected are in the 75 to 200 range. They're also where most of the people with this tax increase, and I think I might have this chart in there twice in the print. Yeah, it's where also with most of the people in the tax increase are slightly higher. So these are people in the more moderate income levels as opposed to the higher income levels. And if you look at Kentucky, there are fewer people with relatively fewer people with a tax cut, and surprisingly, Texas also relatively fewer people with a tax cut. That's because fewer people are itemizing deductions in Texas, and the reason for that is because Texas has no state income tax. So there are more people in Texas on the standard deduction than in some of the other states. So there's this interaction between other itemized deductions and the mortgage deduction that affects these results. If we look at the percentage with a tax increase, that should be the next one. All right, and there the tax increases are concentrated in the over 200K case. This shows option 1 and option 2. I'll just skip this detail, move on to option 3, the next slide, and that's where the biggest percentage with the tax increases are California and New York. Also, and Kentucky has almost as many with a tax increase in the over 200K class, but since Kentucky's income is lower on average, there are fewer people in Kentucky with a tax increase as a share of the population. Finally, I wanted to have one slide as the percentage of tax units with a tax increase when you limit the deduction to $500,000, and that varies regionally, only 0.8% in the nation as a whole, but in California and D.C., you've got the biggest numbers, and that's really a function of where the high-cost houses are, because that determines who's affected by the cap. Hawaii, I guess, is an expensive state for housing. Maryland and Virginia and D.C. are up there too, but for the United States as a whole, it's significantly lower. So that gives you some idea of what might happen if you had a regional cap. That might even out some of these numbers. Finally, let me make a couple of concluding remarks, because these slides and the material we looked at have to do with the gains and losses, the winners and losers, the income distribution effects of this proposal, which is by and large progressive, shifts the benefit of the subsidy to people with more modest incomes. But also, it's important to note the incentive effects. The mortgage interest deduction today is going mostly to high-income people and to itemizers, who are the people who would probably be most likely to own homes without a subsidy. In fact, if you look at countries without a mortgage deduction, the homeownership rate is roughly similar to what it is in the United States. So we think the biggest effect of the mortgage interest deduction is not so much to get more people to own homes, but to encourage them to own bigger and more expensive homes, and in some areas to drive up the prices of housing. The credit, on the other hand, because it's a little more broad-based, would have the effect of giving subsidies to people more at the lower end of the distribution, and those who would be more likely to change their homeowner status as a result of the incentive. So I will conclude and leave some time for questions.
All right, thanks.
And by the way, I want to acknowledge my colleague, Chenzi Liu, who was a co-author of this study and who prepared the slides.
Thank you. I think we're going to open it up for questions now. I think there's a few people that probably have questions. So let's open it up.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Do we have any questions?
Great, yeah. So we do have a few questions to get us started. So Andrew talked near the beginning about the idea of, and this is something supported by President Trump, the idea of increasing the standard deduction. Can you talk a little bit more about what impact that would have and whether that would make the proposal to convert mortgage interest deduction to a tax credit any more or any less appealing?
Well, it would certainly make the proposal more expensive, because with the standard deduction higher, a lot fewer people would be taking the mortgage interest deduction. We're estimating for, I can't remember exactly what was for Trump's proposal, but for the House GOP proposal, which would double the standard deduction and make other changes like including eliminating the state and local income tax deduction, and property tax, state and local tax deductions totally, that the effect of that proposal would be to reduce the number of itemizers by about 80%. So it would certainly mean a lot fewer people would be using the mortgage interest deduction. So I might make this proposal more effective or appealing to those people who want to at least maintain some kind of subsidy for homes.
Okay.
But also more expensive.
Yeah. So what about the differences in housing markets in different communities, different states and metro areas across the country? Of course, some markets are more expensive than others, and as a result, in some places, mortgages in general are more expensive in some places than in others. In the United for Homes proposal in particular, Andrew, maybe you can address this. Can you talk about why we propose a change in the cap that's uniform across the country, and why we don't propose a cap change that would be based on local housing markets
My impression is that we stuck with a standard cap because it's not as complex to have a standard cap. I would say that's probably a main reason why, at the moment it's a standard cap of 1.1 million, and then, we just proposed lowering that because we'll just keep with the standard because it's less complex, and I would imagine it's easier for the IRS to deal with. Eric probably has a good...
Yeah, I have a couple of comments on that. I mean, one is your proposal has been proposed before. President Bush's tax reform panel did propose a cap that was tied to geographic, very good geographic areas. Of course, that proposal didn't go anywhere. That wasn't the reason for it necessarily. But, I think one of the arguments you might say, or the counter-argument against the cap, is people do choose where they live, and so there's a question of, if you choose to live in places that are expensive and have nice amenities, why should the government subsidize you more? Now, some people might say, well, there are poor people who live in these places too, although poor people are usually not at the 500,000 level. So I think when you're talking about that, there might be a case to say, well, yeah, I'm more likely to be hit by this if I live in D.C., but there are some benefits to me from living in D.C. instead of living in rural Maryland and commuting an hour. So that's
let's see. So there's some, especially in sort of in the realtor community, who would say that the vast majority of its beneficiaries are actually middle-class homeowners. But our data shows that 84% of the benefit goes to households, wealthier households, those with incomes above $100,000. Can you talk about that a little bit and sort of, talk about that difference? On the one hand, the idea that the beneficiaries are middle-class homeowners, on the other, data that highlights that it's actually mostly higher-income households.
All right, so there's a very elastic definition or differences of what people call middle class. And, those of us who live in this area where there are all these high-paid lawyers and lobbyists, if you work for the government, you're a two-earner government couple and you make $200,000, you think you're middle class. But if you look at the national data, your $200,000 income is way above the average for the country. So, a middle-income family might make $70,000 or so instead of $200,000 or $250,000. So, it depends on what you call middle. It is true that the very highest income people don't benefit that much as a proportion of their income from the mortgage deduction. It's definitely what you might call an upper middle income subsidy. It doesn't benefit the top 1%, but it definitely benefits disproportionately the top fifth. So depends on how you look at it.
Yeah.
Well, and if you go back and look at some of Eric's slides, I remember the one slide about the percentage of homeowners who currently benefit from the MID and the percentage that would benefit from the tax credit. I would say, it's more middle income households would benefit from the tax credit than from the mortgage interest deduction. If you're looking at households between like 50,000 and
125 or something.
Yeah. So so to me that's middle class, and so this proposal actually expands the benefit for not
middle class,
modern from low to middle class households. Low income to moderate income households.
Right. It doesn't help very low income households because they are not. It's not refundable.
Right.
Okay. Let's see. So, what about? Can you talk a little bit about how the mid-reform proposal would impact economic inequality based on gender, based on race?
I don't have any data based on gender or race. I mean, I would imagine, given the income distribution by gender and race, it probably helps single women. It probably helps minorities on average more than white people. But that's, we don't have any separate data on that.
I would agree with that. I mean, I would say that we know if we think about household income and median income for different groups and median wealth for different groups, that having a tax credit would probably improve, probably be more people have a tax credit.
We did do one study in 2000, which we merged some data with our housing folks who use the American Housing Survey, and I believe they found that proposals like this that would substitute a credit for a deduction would help minorities. But that's something you could look up on. I think the study was from the year 2010.
So that's still up on your website?
Yeah, it's still up on our website. Right.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so a couple of other questions coming in.
Good.
So if we're thinking about and talking about factoring cost of mortgage interest deduction into cost of housing, into how the federal government invests in housing, we're sort of just thinking about actually not how the government invests in housing, but how homeowners invest in their housing costs. Can you talk about how lowering the cap would impact home values? Whether there'd be an immediate negative impact on housing costs, whether that there's some who might claim that these proposals would send home values crashing. Maybe the reality is that, you know, the impact would be a lot more moderate.
You know, I think it's very variable by geographic areas. It's certainly in areas where the price has been built up, where it's very densely populated, and subsidies tend to drive up the price more than they drive up quantity. The effect on price would be bigger. I think one mitigating factor is that many of the highest income households who would be affected by the cap, a lower cap, are people who are, if they're older, not the young high-income households who don't have a lot of wealth, but the older ones who have built up some wealth are really in a position where they can pay down their mortgage if the deduction is eliminated. And so in fact, our revenue estimates of the proposal assume that people with positive interest income will pay down their mortgage. They won't receive taxable interest income and paid mortgage at the same time, a non-deductible mortgage at the same time. So I think there would be some adjustments that would mitigate the effect for the very highest income people. The highest income people wouldn't be quite as badly affected as these numbers show.
So we have just one other question right now, which is about accessing the research, Eric, that you were citing in your part of the presentation.
Right.
Where can people find that?
Okay, so that, I guess if you put up the last slide again.
We have the contact information on the last slide of this webinar. So the contact information and where to find studies. Just this study as well as other studies done by the Tax Policy Center, we moved the link to the last.
Right.
So
it's www.taxpolicycenter.org.
Perfect. All right.
So
Any other questions?
Those are all the questions we have so far.
So now I'm going to pass it over to Renee, who has a few comments.
Thank you, Andrew. Just a couple of things. So there is a tax march happening this Saturday, April the 16th. And this is where advocates from across the country will march in Washington, D.C. and in over 180 cities across the country to demand transparency in government and fairness in our tax code. So if you have an opportunity to join a march here in D.C. or in one of the cities, like I said, across the country, please do so. I think this is a great opportunity to show your support for transparency in the tax code. And also, you know, this tax march, it comes as Congress and the administration as they turn their attention to comprehensive tax reform. So if you do have an opportunity, again, to participate, that would be fantastic. And also, too, we'll share on the last slide the information where you can find a city in your, find a city that is having the tax march. Also, we have our next webinar that will be held on May the 10th at 2 p.m. If you haven't done so already, if you can register for that, that would be fantastic. Next slide is where we have the links. So again, if you want more information on the study that Eric talked about during his presentation, you can find it at www.taxpolicycenter.org. And also information on the Tax March can be found at taxmarch.org, www.taxmarch.org. If you have questions for Eric or for Andrew, we have their email addresses on the screen, so certainly feel free to contact either Eric or Andrew with your questions. And also, too, if you can follow us via Twitter and Facebook, we have our handles and the URLs there for you to follow us in the United for Homes campaign. Thank you very much for participating on today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you next month.